Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to look at some of the issues and concerns related to renting housing versus owning it outright. We'll start by looking at some of the vocabulary. We'll talk about some of the key terms and concepts, and then we'll talk briefly about a process that you can go through to rent your own apartment. So first we start with some terminology. The first term is this word tenant. When you see the word tenant, we're talking about somebody who is paying rent. That is somebody who is paying to live in somebody else's home. They are the ones who are looking for a place to live and are paying for the privilege of spending time in your building. Landlord is the person who owns the property and then is renting it to the tenant. The two sides, tenant and landlord, will sign and agree to what's called a lease, which is a legal contract. It is an agreement signed by the tenant and the landlord that lays out all of the rules and regulations that govern the rental of the apartment. Many times, what you'll find is that a landlord will require what's called a security deposit, which is money paid by the renter, by the tenant, to protect the landlord from any damage that the tenant may create. So when we talk about the security deposit, we're talking about the responsibility of the tenant to make sure that the apartment is not damaged or left a mess when the lease is up. So many times the landlord will use that security deposit for a cleaning service, for example, to come in and clean your apartment if you didn't clean it enough to their standards when you leave the apartment, because they do need to offer it to somebody else, and no one wants to rent a dirty apartment. So if you leave it dirty, your security deposit will pay to get it cleaned. If they don't use all the security deposit, or they didn't need it at all, then they will return that to you within a specified period of time, typically covered by the lease. Your lease will cover a number of different items. It could, for example, cover and will the length of your rental. How long are you planning to stay there? Is it a month-to-month agreement where you have to sign a new contract every month, or is it a 3-month contract, 6 months, 12 months? The term is sort of up to you and the landlord, but traditionally most rental agreements cover about a 12-month period. The lease will also cover how much you owe in rent. That's the monthly payment that you have to give your landlord, and when will that payment be due. Many places will have a pet policy. Some apartments allow you to have a dog or a cat. Some do not. Some limit the size of the dog or cat that you have, and it really just depends on the lease. Because you're borrowing somebody else's housing, they get to decide whether or not there are things that you can do in their home or not while you're there as a renter. Many policies cover, leases cover the security deposit. They cover things like maintenance. For example, is the landlord responsible for fixing clogs in the sink or a broken toilet, or are they responsible only for like the roof and the air conditioning? Each lease may be different. Typically, the maintenance of the home is the responsibility of the landlord unless it is specifically written in the contract otherwise. And then there's also this one which sometimes comes up, is a policy related to subletting. Subletting is a question about whether or not you're able to, as a renter, rent out your apartment to another person. Sometimes that happens if you're going to go on a long vacation, say for a month or two. You might choose to rent your apartment to another person while you're gone. And sometimes that's allowed by the lease and sometimes it's not. So you need to make sure that if you plan on doing an Airbnb, for example, in your apartment while you're gone for 2 or 3 months for summer vacation during college, for example, that you're allowed to actually do that, because you may not be able to according to the lease. The lease may also cover things like parking and how many spots do you get and where can you park your car. It may have issues related to the amenities you can access, like the pool or the weight room, and whether guests have access to those or not, and whether you have to pay for it. So the lease covers basically every possible issue related to your ability to use the rental property. There are a number of reasons why you might choose to rent versus owning your home outright that are worth considering. One is that it's less costly. It generally costs less to rent than it does to buy. You don't have to put in a down payment like you do for a house. You don't have to pay property tax. like you do for a house. You don't have as many maintenance costs as you do for a house, and so renting in the short term can be cheaper than owning your home. You have increased mobility because you're only locked into a lease for as long as the term of the lease. It could be 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And even if you don't want to stay for the whole 12 months, maybe you decide that you hate your job, you hate where you live, you want to move somewhere else, you can leave by paying a penalty or a fee for leaving early and breaking your lease, and you can go anywhere you want. But when you own your home, you're kind of stuck there until you can sell it, and that can take weeks or months, probably more like months, before that can get done. So you're not as tied down when you rent. Like I said, you don't have to do maintenance, or at least not most maintenance, so it's cheaper and a lot more convenient for you as an individual. You might have to mow the lawn or take care of the landscaping, but a lot of the big repairs that homeowners are responsible for will fall under the responsibility of the landlord. And a lot of apartments and rental homes offer a number of amenities that you couldn't afford on your own. A lot of places may have weight rooms, pools, party rooms, basketball courts, that you wouldn't be able to pay for on your own as a single-family home owner. But as part of an apartment, the cost is spread across so many people that you end up having a lot of nice amenities where you live. So while you might not be able to afford a 2-lane pool at your house, at your apartment, you can have access to it. There are some disadvantages to renting that you should consider, though, before making the decision to rent over owning. One is that you don't have any sort of tax advantage. That is, when you pay your rent, you don't have any of that money taken off of your taxes as a tax deduction. Whereas when you own your home and you're paying a mortgage, you do get to reduce the amount of money you spend on your interest from your income. So there is a tax savings to owning a home. You're not building equity either, meaning you keep paying every month, and in fact you're going to continue to pay every month for the rest of your life as long as you're renting. And you're not building up value in an investment. Whereas in a home, when you're making payments and your home is appreciating in value, you are gaining what we call equity, which is a financial gain to you. It builds your net worth. When you rent, you can't upgrade very easily because it's not your property. And so if you want to make changes to it, you have to get the approval of the landlord in order to do it. And oftentimes they will say no. So you are limited to what the color of the walls are, or where the walls are located, or what your appliances are, and things like that. So if you want the freedom to make decisions about the look of your home, renting may not be your best choice. And you are limited to a lot of the rules because it's not your home. You don't get to decide whether you're allowed parties or overnight guests or where can they park or things like that. You are sort of left to whatever the landlord chooses to allow you to do. So if you're going to look for an apartment, the most important thing you need to do is determine what is your budget. How much money do you have available each month to pay for rent? Because there are a lot of apartments that run the whole spectrum of cost, and you need to figure out what is the maximum you can afford, what is the maximum you're willing to pay, and then begin to look from there. You also need to set a list of criteria. What are you looking for out of an apartment? Do you want it to be a very large apartment? Do you not care about square footage? Maybe you care about whether you're allowed a pet, or maybe you care about being close to mass transit, or close to work, or near the city, or near friends and family. Only you know what the criteria are that you want out of your apartment. And you should be setting 3 or 4 must-haves criteria and use those criteria to evaluate whether or not certain apartments are a good fit for you. So research your options and be very clear about what's out there and how do they compare to each other based on the criteria that you set for yourself. And then once you've found a place that you like, go ahead and make the choice. Go to the apartment, initiate the process of renting, and try and get that apartment before somebody else does. But before you sign the lease, before you finalize your decision on where you're going to live, be sure that you read the lease carefully, because you are responsible for all of the parts of the lease. You are agreeing to all of it at the same time. And if you violate the lease, you run the risk of being evicted or removed from your housing, or you might have fines and fees to pay, and that can become expensive and frustrating when you realize that there's certain things you want to be able to do, but you're prohibited from them because you didn't read the lease. So make sure you understand it, like you should with every contract, before you sign and agree to it. And then make sure you do a thorough walkthrough to make sure that the apartment is in good shape, that there is no damage that has been unreported, because if there is damage that wasn't reported, you could be responsible for it through your security deposit when your lease is up. So if there are any issues, make sure that you make a note of it and have the landlord acknowledge and sign that there were issues when you took over the apartment. Otherwise, you could be responsible for damage that you did not cause. Those are the basics of renting an apartment or renting housing in general. And when we get together in class, we will look at some apartments around here and see what would be a good fit for you. See you then.